Ethan Blake walked into the bar wanting nothing more than a cold beer and 30 minutes of quiet after a 10-hour shift at the plant. Rain drummed lightly against the windows of the Amber Note Lounge, and the air inside carried the mingled scent of whiskey, wood polish, and something savory drifting in from the kitchen. He spotted her the instant he crossed the threshold, a woman sitting alone at the far end of the bar, dressed like she belonged somewhere far grander than a hushed lounge on a rainy Tuesday. She was striking, composed, and utterly still. Seated in a wheelchair, parked neatly beside a bar stool, nobody had bothered to move out of the way. Ethan, never one to think twice before cracking a joke, grinned and closed the distance without a shred of hesitation. "Don't tell me you're my blind date," he said, half laughing, braced for an eye roll or maybe nothing at all. The woman raised her head slowly. She looked him over, unreadable. Then a faint smile touched her mouth. "No," she said, "I'm the woman who's canceled 33 blind dates because every single man walked away the second he saw this chair." Ethan felt his stomach drop. The bar noise seemed to fade for a beat, replaced by the quiet heft of her words. He opened his mouth, searching for something clever, and came up empty. 10 minutes later, without fully knowing how he got there, he was sitting across from her, 2 drinks between them, and a whole conversation waiting to unspool. He had no idea the woman in front of him was one of the most powerful executives in the city, a name splashed across business headlines and quarterly reports. He only saw a stranger who just told him the truth in a way nobody else ever had. The city outside had settled into that particular gray hush autumn brings before winter fully lands. Streetlights flicking on early, everyone walking a little faster toward wherever they were headed. Ethan had spent most of the afternoon wrestling with a set of specs that refused to add up, no matter how many times he recalculated the tolerances, the kind of stubborn problem that trails a person home long after the monitor goes dark. He wasn't a man who complained much, but by 6 o'clock he felt every one of his 39 years pressing on his shoulders like a weight he'd carried too long without setting down. He'd clocked out at 6 sharp, worn out from rechecking blueprints on a project that wouldn't cooperate. 2 coworkers, Ray and Sam, had invited him to drinks at the usual sports bar down the block. Loud TVs, cheap nachos. Ethan begged off, telling them he wanted somewhere quieter, somewhere without a crowd yelling at a football game. He drove a few extra blocks and parked outside a narrow jazz lounge he'd passed 100 times but never entered. The place was dim, lit in amber, filled with the low murmur of a saxophone drifting from a small corner stage. He ordered a beer and let his shoulders drop for the first time all day, scanning the room out of habit more than curiosity. That's when he saw her, near the end of the bar, in a wheelchair, wearing a deep green blouse that made her look like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread. Nobody was approaching her. Nobody even glanced her way twice, as if the chair beside her had become an invisible wall, keeping the rest of the room at a careful distance. Ethan assumed she was waiting on someone, a date running late, a friend stuck in traffic. He nearly walked past without a word, but something about how she sat there, composed and unbothered despite being plainly ignored, pulled him over instead. He leaned against the bar a few feet off and let the joke slip out before he could stop it, in that easy, self-deprecating tone he used whenever a room felt too quiet. Her answer landed like a quiet blow, honest in a way that startled him more than any raised voice could have. He didn't over-apologize, didn't stumble through a string of sorries the way most people might after a comment like that. He simply asked if he could sit, and she nodded once, as if granting him the chance to prove him he was different from the 33 men before him. The bartender brought 2 more drinks without being asked, clearly familiar with her order, and the 2 of them fell into the kind of talk strangers sometimes have when neither expected it to lead anywhere. It started slow, the careful back and forth of two people testing whether the other was worth the effort. Ethan told her about growing up outside the city, the son of a mechanic who taught him everything about engines before he ever set foot in an engineering classroom. He mentioned his marriage without lingering on it, a relationship that once felt permanent until it quietly came apart under the weight of two people who'd stopped choosing each other. His daughter lived with her mother in another state now, and though he missed her fiercely, he'd learned to carry that distance without letting it show every day. Vivian offered less, her words measured, precise, the practiced caution of someone who'd learned oversharing came with a price. She admitted, almost reluctantly, that she hated how people looked at her now, a blend of pity and discomfort dressed up as politeness. She hated the sympathetic tilt of a stranger's head, the overly careful tone people used with her, as if kindness meant treating her like glass. Ethan listened without flinching, without asking the question everyone else always led with. He never once brought up her legs, never asked what happened or how long she'd been in the chair, questions that seemed to hover behind everyone else's eyes the moment they noticed her. Instead, he asked if she liked jazz, nodding toward the trio on stage, and something in her face softened for the first time all evening. She admitted she loved how a saxophone could carry sorrow and joy on the very same note. For a moment, she looked less like a woman guarding herself and more like someone simply enjoying a night out. Ethan confessed he'd never been much of a music person. His taste ran toward whatever played on the radio during long drives, but something about the lounge had pulled him in from the first note. Vivian explained, more animated than she'd been all night, how her father used to spin old jazz records on Sunday mornings while making breakfast, filling their small apartment with sound, long before she understood anything about the genre. She said the music had always felt like a kind of permission, proof that sadness and beauty could share the same breath without canceling each other out. They talked about music a while, the strange comfort of a slow piano line on a rainy night, how certain songs seemed to understand grief better than people did. Vivian laughed then, a real laugh, unguarded and quick, one that surprised even her. Ethan noticed immediately how her whole face changed when the walls dropped even a little. He found himself hoping the night would stretch on longer than it reasonably should. Then her phone buzzed against the bar top. She glanced at the screen and answered with a clipped, controlled greeting. Her voice shifted instantly, sharp, authoritative, entirely in command. She discussed a contract renegotiation, mentioned figures that made Ethan's eyebrows lift, and gave instructions with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed without question. When she hung up, she offered no explanation, just apologized for the interruption and steered the conversation back to safer ground. For a moment, he wondered if he should just ask outright who she was, whether that sudden shift in her voice belonged to a job title she preferred to keep quiet during an evening meant for escape rather than explanation. He decided against it, reasoning that a woman who'd spent her whole night dodging the pity of strangers probably didn't want to spend the rest of it defending her career, too. There was something quietly respectful in choosing not to pry, in letting her decide on her own schedule how much of herself to share with someone she'd only just met. Ethan felt a small flicker of curiosity he chose not to voice, sensing that pushing too hard might close a door that had only just opened. They talked another hour, about books she never had time to finish, cities he'd always meant to visit, until a black SUV pulled up outside and a man in a dark suit stepped out to open the door for her. Vivian said goodnight politely, thanked him for the conversation without offering her full name, and let the driver wheel her toward the entrance. Ethan watched from his seat, thrown by the sudden formality of her exit, the quiet efficiency of a routine clearly rehearsed many times before. He sat there a while longer, finishing his beer, wondering exactly who she was and why the question suddenly mattered so much. The next morning, Ethan stood in his kitchen making coffee, the TV murmuring in the background, scrolling through nothing in particular. A business segment cut into the weather report, the anchor announcing that Vivian Cross, CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech firms in the country, had just closed an $8 billion acquisition. The photo on screen showed the same woman from the night before, composed and confident, seated in her wheelchair at the head of a boardroom table, surrounded by executives twice her age. Ethan nearly dropped his mug, coffee sloshing over the rim as he stared, disbelieving. The woman he'd joked with over drinks, the one who'd answered his careless comment with such devastating honesty, was one of the most powerful business figures in the city. He set the mug down slowly, replaying their conversation, hunting for any hint he'd missed, any clue to who she really was. Across town, in an office overlooking the skyline, Vivian sat behind her desk long after her assistant had gone home, unable to focus on the reports stacked neatly in front of her. She kept circling back to the man from the bar, the easy way he'd spoken to her without flinching, without softening his voice into that careful, pitying whisper she'd grown to despise. He hadn't treated her like something fragile, hadn't stumbled over his words trying to prove how comfortable he was around her disability. He'd simply talked to her, the way anyone would talk to another interesting person they'd just met. For the first time in longer than she cared to admit, Vivian found herself thinking about someone outside the walls of her carefully controlled world. She'd built an empire from nothing, survived a boardroom full of men who doubted her the moment the accident changed her life, and learned to trust almost no one who approached her afterward. Yet something about Ethan Blake refused to leave her thoughts, a stubborn warmth she hadn't felt in years. Against every instinct telling her to stay guarded, she made a decision that surprised even her. She went back to the same jazz lounge 3 nights later, telling her assistant only that she needed an evening free of meetings and calls. She dressed simpler this time, less executive, more like a woman hoping to be seen as ordinary for a few hours. Ethan arrived not long after, having found himself returning to that bar more often than he could explain, half hoping and half denying that he wanted to see her again. When their eyes met across the room, neither pretended surprise, the pull between them too honest to disguise as coincidence. This time, there was no careful testing of boundaries, no polite filler meant to occupy silence. They talked about the books that shaped them as kids, the cities they'd longed to visit before life got complicated, the small failures that quietly taught them who they eventually became. Vivian mentioned a novel she'd read 3 times over the years. Ethan admitted he'd never finished it, sparking a debate that carried them through 2 more rounds of drinks. She laughed more that night than she had in the past 3 years combined, a sound that startled the bartender, who'd grown used to her quiet, guarded presence. Ethan felt something loosen in his chest, too, the heaviness of years spent bracing against disappointment starting to ease. The staff at the lounge began to notice the pattern, murmuring to one another that the striking woman in the wheelchair and the easygoing man with tired eyes seemed like they belonged together, whether either of them realized it yet or not. The bartender, a quiet man named Marcus who'd worked there nearly 2 decades, started reserving the same corner table without either of them asking, setting a candle on the surface as if the small gesture might somehow shield whatever was blooming between his 2 regulars. Vivian noticed the thoughtfulness and left him a generous tip each time, though she never said so outright, preferring to let her gratitude speak through small, quiet gestures rather than grand ones. Ethan noticed it too, and found himself grateful for a place that, without either of them asking, had become something like a sanctuary from the rest of their separate, complicated lives. There were nights they said very little, content just to sit beside each other and listen to the 3 play some slow, aching tune neither of them could name. Vivian told him once that silence with the right person felt entirely different from silence with everyone else, less like absence, more like company.
Ethan understood exactly what she meant, having spent years after his divorce mistaking loneliness for independence, until he realized how much lighter an empty room could feel if someone simply chose to stay in it. Weeks passed in a rhythm neither of them planned but both quietly welcomed. Evenings at the lounge stretching into conversations that ran past midnight. Ethan knew Vivian had money. That much was obvious from the moment the SUV pulled up that first night. What he hadn't fully grasped was the scale of her world, the billions attached to her name, the empire she'd built from the wreckage of an accident that could have destroyed anyone else. One evening, Vivian invited him to dinner at a restaurant he'd only ever seen photographed in glossy magazines, the kind of place booked out months in advance. Ethan showed up in his old pickup, the same one he'd driven since college, parking it awkwardly among a row of luxury cars outside the entrance. He wore his best shirt, pressed carefully the night before, unaware a photographer nearby had already caught the image of him climbing out of his truck.
That truck. By morning, the photo had spread across every major business outlet in the city, paired with headlines questioning why a billionaire executive was dining with a blue-collar engineer driving a rusted pickup. Commentators speculated endlessly about her judgment, whether she was slumming it for attention or making a reckless personal choice unfit for her position. The story spread faster than either of them expected, turning a quiet dinner into a public spectacle neither had asked for. Financial columnists who'd never met Ethan wrote entire pieces speculating about his motives, some claiming he was chasing money, others insisting he was part of some publicity stunt cooked up by a struggling engineering firm. Talk show hosts joked about the mismatch during morning segments, framing the story as an oddity rather than two adults who'd simply found something honest in each other. Ethan avoided reading most of it, though a few of the crueler headlines reached him anyway, forwarded by well-meaning friends who thought he should know. At his old workplace, co-workers who used to share lunch breaks with him now whispered behind closed doors, unsure how to treat a man suddenly thrust into a story none of them understood. Some treated him with a strange new deference, as if proximity to Vivian's wealth had elevated his worth overnight. Others grew distant, uneasy with a colleague who no longer fit neatly into the ordinary rhythm of their working lives. Ethan found the whole experience isolating in a way he hadn't anticipated, caught between two worlds that both seemed to view him as an outsider. Vivian's board called an emergency meeting within days, several members voicing open concern that her personal life was becoming a distraction from the company's carefully managed image. Shareholders murmured about stock volatility, about optics, about whether her judgment could be trusted if she was willing to risk her reputation over a man from outside her world. One of the older board members, a man named Gerald Ashford, who'd sat on the company's founding committee, spoke with particular bluntness, arguing that public perception mattered as much as quarterly earnings when it came to investor confidence. He suggested, not unkindly but firmly, that Vivian consider how the relationship might be framed as a liability rather than a personal matter beyond the company's concern. Other members nodded along, some out of genuine conviction, others simply following the loudest voice in the room, until the meeting closed with an unofficial but unmistakable expectation hanging in the air. Vivian sat through it with practiced composure, though something inside her twisted uncomfortably at the thought of losing what little happiness she'd only just begun to rediscover. That same week, sitting together in her penthouse after the storm of headlines had begun to settle, Vivian finally told Ethan the truth about the accident that had changed everything 3 years earlier. She'd been driving home from a late meeting when another vehicle ran a red light, slamming into the side of her car with enough force to shatter her spine in 2 places. She spent months in recovery, learning to accept a body that no longer moved the way it once had, grieving a version of herself she'd never get back. Her fiancé at the time, a man she'd planned to marry within the year, ended things less than 2 months after the accident, unable to picture a future that included a wheelchair. Friends who'd once filled her calendar with brunches and vacations slowly stopped calling, uncomfortable with a version of her they no longer knew how to relate to. Every date she attempted afterward followed the same painful pattern: men interested until the moment they saw the chair, after which their enthusiasm quietly evaporated. She described the weeks in the hospital that followed, the endless procession of doctors delivering updates in careful, clinical language meant to soften news that couldn't truly be softened. She remembered staring at the ceiling of her hospital room for hours, replaying the sound of the impact, the screech of metal, and the sudden silence after it, a silence she still heard sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep. She'd built her whole identity around control, around being the person who solved problems rather than became one, and the accident had stripped that identity away in a single unbearable instant. Ethan listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening at the thought of anyone treating her with such casual cruelty. When she finished, he asked the only question that mattered to him in that moment, quiet and sincere. "Did it hurt?" he asked, "that day when it happened?" Vivian stared at him for a long moment, something breaking open behind her eyes. No one had ever asked her that before, not her doctors, not her family, not even the fiancé who'd once claimed to love her completely. Every conversation about the accident had always circled logistics, recovery timelines, insurance claims, adjustments to her office and home. Nobody had ever paused to ask about the pain itself, the fear she'd felt in those seconds before everything changed forever. She began to cry, quietly at first, then more freely than she'd allowed herself in years, the weight of 3 years finally finding release in front of someone who'd simply asked the right question. Ethan didn't try to fix it or offer empty comfort. He simply stayed beside her, letting the silence between them hold space for everything she'd never been able to say out loud. It was, in its own quiet way, the most intimate moment either of them had experienced in a long time. The peace between them didn't last long once the media caught wind of the deeper story underneath. Reporters dug into Ethan's past with an intensity that felt almost predatory, uncovering details about his divorce, interviewing his ex-wife for quotes she likely never intended to give in that context. His old workplace received calls from journalists asking about his character, his reliability, his suitability for someone of Vivian's stature. His ex-wife, caught off guard by a reporter outside her home, gave a comment about their failed marriage that was twisted into a headline suggesting Ethan had a history of running from commitment. His former co-workers grew uneasy, unsure how to act around a man suddenly thrust into a spotlight none of them understood. Ethan found himself defending his own life story to strangers who'd never met him, exhausted by scrutiny he never asked to invite. The board escalated their pressure on Vivian, presenting her with an ultimatum dressed up in careful corporate language. Either she distanced herself from Ethan entirely, restoring the company's controlled image, or she risked a vote of no confidence that could threaten her position as CEO. Vivian sat through it with a calm exterior, though the ultimatum shook something deep within her. It was never about the money, never about the title or the power she'd fought so hard to build. What frightened her most was the growing realization that her presence in Ethan's life was actively destroying the peace he once had, dragging him into a world of scrutiny he never wanted. She lay awake many nights weighing the cost of staying against the cost of watching him unravel under pressure that was entirely her fault. Ethan noticed the toll it was taking on her, the tightness in her shoulders, the exhaustion behind her eyes no amount of makeup could fully hide. He watched the news coverage pick up apart his character night after night, watched Vivian's board circle closer with each passing week, and made a decision he believed was the only way to protect her without a dramatic confrontation, without accusations or tears. He simply began to pull away, choosing distance over the slow destruction he feared was coming for both of them. Within days, Ethan changed his phone number, telling only his closest family. He submitted his resignation at the engineering firm where he'd worked over a decade, citing personal reasons he refused to explain further. He packed a single bag and left the city entirely, driving north toward a small town where nobody recognized his face from the headlines that had dominated local news for weeks. Vivian discovered his disappearance the following morning when her calls went straight to a disconnected line, panic rising in her chest in a way she hadn't felt since the accident itself. She sent people to his apartment only to find it emptied out, his landlord confirming he'd left without a forwarding address. For the first time since building her empire from nothing, Vivian Cross felt completely powerless, her money and influence useless against a man determined to vanish. She hired investigators, called in favors from contacts across multiple states, yet weeks passed without a single lead. At night, alone in the vast penthouse that had once felt like an accomplishment and now felt merely like an empty container, Vivian replayed every conversation they'd shared, searching for the exact moment things had begun slipping away, wondering whether she'd said something wrong, whether her hesitation during the board meetings had somehow convinced him she valued her position over him, though nothing could have been further from the truth. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it offered little comfort, filled instead with fragmented dreams of empty bar stools and unanswered phone calls. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Nora, who'd worked alongside her for nearly 5 years, noticed the change immediately, the uncharacteristic distraction during meetings, the way Vivian's eyes drifted toward the window during long stretches of silence. Nora never asked directly what was wrong, though she began quietly rearranging Vivian's schedule to allow for more unstructured time, sensing her employer needed space to grieve something she hadn't yet found words for. The board, satisfied that the distraction had resolved itself, quietly dropped the pressure, treating the situation as a problem that had solved itself. Vivian found no relief in their satisfaction, only a hollow ache that grew heavier with each passing day. One rainy evening, almost by instinct, she found herself back at the jazz lounge where everything had begun, sitting in the same spot near the end of the bar where Ethan had first spoken to her. The stool beside her remained empty, though something about the space felt different now, weighted with memory rather than isolation. The pianist, an older man who'd played there for years and had grown fond of watching their story unfold from his little corner stage, approached her table with something in his hand. "He left this for you," the pianist said gently, "a few weeks back, before he disappeared. Said you'd come looking eventually." He handed her a folded envelope, worn slightly at the edges from having been carried a while before it was left behind. Vivian's hands trembled as she opened it, recognizing Ethan's handwriting immediately, careful and deliberate, the same way he spoke when he meant every word. The letter began simply, without dramatic flourish, exactly the way Ethan always communicated. "I didn't leave because of the chair," he had written. "I want you to know that clearly, because I suspect part of you might believe that's the reason, and I couldn't bear for you to think that, even for a moment. I left because I watched what my presence was doing to your life, the pressure, the headlines, the boards circling like vultures waiting for you to fail. I couldn't stand being the reason you might lose everything you built after everything you already survived. I told myself leaving was the noble choice, the selfless choice, though if I'm honest, it felt more like running than sacrifice. I think about that first night constantly, the way you answered my careless joke with the truest thing anyone said to me in years. I think about the sound of your laugh at that dinner, how it made the whole restaurant feel quieter somehow, like the world had softened just to listen. I don't regret a single moment we spent together, only the way I chose to end it without giving you the chance to decide for yourself." Vivian read the letter twice, tears falling freely onto the paper, blurring some of the ink near the bottom. She folded it carefully, tucked it into her coat, and asked the pianist if he knew anything more about where Ethan might have gone. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Ethan had spoken once about a small town near the mountains, a place with a cabin he'd inherited from his grandfather years earlier, quiet mornings spent fishing on a small lake near the property when he was a boy, long before responsibility and heartbreak filled the space that simple joy used to occupy. He remembered how Ethan's voice had softened talking about it, the way people speak of somewhere that still feels like home even after years of absence. That small detail became the only real clue Vivian had to work with, but it was enough to set her investigators searching property records across 3 counties. It took 2 days to track down the exact location. Working with an investigator who finally uncovered records of the property under Ethan's grandfather's name, she arranged for a car early one morning, telling no one at the company where she was going, needing this particular journey to belong entirely to her own choice rather than any calculated plan. The drive took nearly 5 hours, winding through roads that grew narrower and quieter the farther she traveled from the city she'd built her life around. When she arrived, she found Ethan outside a modest wooden cabin, sleeves rolled up, hands covered in grease as he worked beneath the hood of an old truck parked in the gravel driveway. He froze the moment he noticed the car pulling in, disbelief crossing his face as Vivian's driver helped her out and wheeled her slowly across the uneven ground toward him. Neither spoke for a long moment, the only sound the quiet rustle of wind through the surrounding pines. "You didn't have to come all this way," Ethan finally said, wiping his hands on a rag, unsure whether to feel relieved or terrified by her sudden appearance. "I didn't come here because I need saving," Vivian said, her voice steady despite the emotion trembling through it. "I came here because I need someone to stay, not someone to run every time things get difficult. I've had enough people leave me because
They thought they were protecting me or protecting themselves, and I'm tired of being treated like something that needs to be handled carefully." Ethan dropped the rag and crossed the distance between them without another word, kneeling in front of her wheelchair so their eyes met at the same level. He wrapped his arms around her carefully, pulling her into an embrace carrying the weight of every unspoken fear either of them had held on to since the letter was written. Vivian held on to him tightly, finally allowing herself to believe this might be something worth trusting completely. Inside the cabin that evening, Ethan built a fire in the old stone hearth his grandfather had laid by hand decades earlier, flames casting warm, flickering light across the wooden walls. Vivian watched him work, struck by how natural he looked in that setting, so different from the polished boardrooms and marble lobbies that made up the rest of her existence. They ate a simple dinner of soup and bread at a small table near the window, talking quietly about nothing important, savoring the strange, fragile peace of simply being together again without an audience watching every move. They stayed in that small cabin for nearly a week, away from headlines and board meetings and the noise of a world that had never fully understood either of them. Ethan told her about his grandfather, who'd built the cabin decades earlier, teaching him everything about patience and craftsmanship long before engineering school ever entered his mind. Vivian told him about the years before the accident, the ambition that once drove her relentlessly, and the strange gift the accident ultimately gave her in teaching her who truly belonged in her life. When they finally returned to the city together, Vivian walked into the boardroom, sitting in her chair at the head of the table with the same composure she always carried, though something in her had visibly shifted. She informed the board plainly that her personal life was no longer open for negotiation, that her judgment as CEO had never once wavered because of who she chose to love. Several members shifted uncomfortably, though none dared challenge the resolve now evident in her voice. A full year passed, carrying both of them through changes neither could have predicted the night they first met in that quiet jazz lounge. Vivian remained at the helm of her company, her leadership stronger than ever. The acquisition she'd closed the same week they met, now recognized as one of the most successful deals in the firm's history. Ethan, with Vivian's quiet encouragement, opened his own engineering consulting firm, specializing in accessible infrastructure design, a field he discovered he cared about deeply after everything he'd learned from loving her. The same board members who'd once pressured Vivian to end the relationship watched over the following months as her leadership grew only steadier, her decisions sharper, her presence in negotiations more commanding than ever. Whatever fear had driven their objections quietly dissolved under the evidence of her continued success, and several of them eventually admitted in private conversations they never expected to have that they'd misjudged the situation entirely. Vivian never sought an apology from any of them, content simply to let her results speak for her the same way she always had. Ethan's new firm grew slowly but steadily, built on a reputation for genuine care rather than flashy marketing, word spreading among architects and city planners who valued his attention to detail. He hired 2 employees within the first 6 months, training both personally, passing along the same patience his grandfather had once shown him in that same mountain cabin. He kept his old pickup truck, refusing every suggestion he traded for something newer, insisting it had earned its place beside him through the whole complicated, wonderful mess of the past year. Their story became something of a quiet legend among people who followed both business news and matters of the heart, a reminder that resilience and love weren't mutually exclusive. Young employees at Vivian's company sometimes mentioned the story quietly among themselves, treating it less like gossip and more like proof that even someone at the very top of an organization could choose honesty over convenience when it mattered most. A few, inspired by what they'd witnessed, began speaking more openly about their own struggles, whether visible or hidden, no longer as afraid of being defined by them within the company's walls. Vivian noticed the shift and found unexpected pride in it, realizing her personal life, once treated as a liability, had quietly become something closer to a gift for the people around her. Neither of them sought attention for it, though the story found its way into interviews and profiles regardless, often framed as an example of authenticity triumphing over public pressure. Vivian, once fiercely private about her personal life, found herself occasionally willing to speak about it, though always on her own terms. At an annual gala honoring outstanding leaders in business, Vivian stood at a podium accepting an award for her contributions to the technology industry. The room filled with executives, reporters, and members of the very board that once pressured her to abandon the relationship entirely. She spoke about resilience, about rebuilding after loss, about the quiet strength required to keep leading a company through uncertainty. Near the end of her remarks, her tone softened, shifting from the polished language of business into something far more personal. "The most remarkable thing," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd before finding the one person who mattered most, "isn't when someone finally notices your strength despite your struggles. It's when they simply forget you ever had something to overcome in the first place, because to them you were never broken to begin with." The camera in the room turned towards Ethan, seated near the front in a well-tailored suit, his expression carrying the same easy warmth that had first drawn her months earlier. He smiled, the very same smile that opened their story with a careless joke in a quiet bar on a rainy night. "Don't tell me you're my blind date," he mouthed silently across the room, the private joke only the two of them fully understood. Vivian laughed softly into the microphone, the sound carrying warmth rather than performance. "Yes," she said, simply, before adding, almost under her breath but loud enough for the room to hear, "and this time, forever." The two of them left the gala later that evening, walking slowly beneath the soft glow of golden lights lining the entrance of the building. Passers-by glanced at them the way people always had, though the nature of those glances had changed somehow, curiosity replacing pity,
admiration replacing discomfort, as though the city itself had slowly learned to see her the way Ethan always had. Vivian's wheelchair moved beside him, steady and familiar, no longer a symbol of everything she had lost, but rather a quiet reminder of everything she had ultimately gained. It stood in that moment and every moment after as proof that genuine love was never born from perfection, but from the simple, deliberate choice of two people who learned to see each other fully, beyond every limitation the world tried to place between them.